Hello everyone, Stephanie Haney here, and I have an update for you that might be related to the criminal case against business owner Bobby George, but also might not be. I'm talking about the $3.5 million in funding that was pulled from a project that Bobby George was involved in. This was pulled in the transportation budget. Well, Bobby George's father, Tony George, who is the sole member of the George Group Corporation, his attorney has now sent a letter to Ohio lawmakers, people in the Ohio House, people in the Ohio Senate, and Governor Mike DeWine, telling them to preserve evidence for a possible lawsuit. Tony George's attorney told me that they believe that the criminal allegations against Bobby George are not the reason that that funding is pulled. Now, that's exactly what Senator Rob McCauley said. He said that that was the reason that the funding was pulled. Senate spokesperson for the Republicans, John Fortney, also said that's the reason that the funding was pulled. But attorney Scott Pullins told me that they believe it was an ulterior motive, that they believe that the reason the funding was pulled was political retaliation for their support of former Ohio House Speaker Jason Stephens. Now, I want to take you back in time to when this $3.5 million allocation was put forward in the first place. It was part of the capital funding bill, and that was passed and signed into law by Governor DeWine in June 2024. At the time, Representative Jason Stephens was the Speaker of the House. Now, this is about a project, the Flats River development, that was to take place in the Flats East Bank. The representative from that district is Representative Terrence Upchurch. So I asked him back in 2024, who's the person who put forth this amendment? Who's the person who started the process to get this $3.5 million allocated to a project for the George family? He said it was not him, but couldn't tell me who it was. So we don't know who it was who led the charge to get this money allocated in the first place back in 2024. But then in March, the Senate pulled that funding. They canceled the allocation in the transportation budget, which passed and was signed on March 31st by Governor DeWine. We also don't know who put that forward. It was part of a group of more than a dozen amendments and not attached to any single name. So we don't know who made it happen, and we don't know who made it stop. But we do know that the Senate leadership says that they pulled it because of the allegations against Bobby George. Those allegations, to remind you, are attempted murder, rape, and kidnapping, which Bobby George has said he is innocent of. Well, Scott Pullins says that they actually believe, after looking into this and talking around town, that it wasn't the reason. The criminal allegations were not the reason for the pulling of that funding. Again, as I said, they believe that the reason was the George families and their allies' support of Representative Jason Stephens. Now, if you know anything about Ohio politics, there was battling behind the scenes between current Speaker of the House, Matt Huffman, and Representative Jason Stephens as to who was going to lead the House once Matt Huffman moved from the Senate to the House. Matt Huffman was term limited in the Ohio Senate, was elected, moved over to the Ohio House, and is now the Speaker of the House. Now, I reached out to Representative Stephens. I also reached out to Representative Huffman. I also reached out to the leadership in the Senate. I didn't hear back from Representatives Huffman and Stephens. I did hear back from Senate leadership spokesperson, the Republican spokesperson, John Fortney, who told me that he stands by his initial statement that the reason for pulling the funding back was because of the allegations against Bobby George. Now, interestingly enough, in this preservation letter, it names several topics of interest. So they're asking for preservation of records related to multiple George family members, including Bobby George and Tony George, and then also multiple business entities, and also lobbyist Bobby Ina. Bobby Ina is the only topic of interest named as an individual that is not a George family member. So I asked attorney Scott Pullins, I said, why is Bobby Ina named in this letter? And he said because they want to see if he was involved in the effort being what they believe is political retaliation for the George families and their allies' support of Representative Stephens. So I asked lobbyist Bobby Ina about this, and he said, quote, "They think a lot of themselves. I don't have time to waste on the Georges." So that was his response to that. Now, I also reached out to Governor Mike DeWine's office and asked about them receiving the preservation letter. And DeWine's office confirmed to me they did receive the letter, but said it's not something that they would comment about. And so this preservation letter, as Scott Pullins told me when I emailed with him, he said that this is the first step to see if there were any rules broken. So this is not the first step in a lawsuit, but what it is preparing for the possibility of the lawsuit. So it's my understanding that they intend to submit some records requests and see what those record requests show, because they do believe that the reason was political retaliation and not the stated reason, which was the criminal allegations ongoing against Bobby George. So that's your latest update. As of now, that $3.5 million remains pulled back from the project, which was, quote, the Flats River Development Project. That's how it shows up in the legislation, by the way. To look at the legislation, you wouldn't know that it was necessarily aligned with or involved with the George family project. And that's the latest. We'll let you know more when I know more.